Hi, this is the Demographics Decoded podcast with me, demographer Simon Kuestenmacher.
And me, Michael Yardney, wealth and property expert. And this is the podcast where we unveil the trends shaping our futures. In today's episode, we start the 4-part series regarding the various demographic groups. I believe this sort of information is going to be valuable for employers to understand their team members, for employees to better understand those that they work with, and how their bosses think. It's going to be critical for business people to understand who their clients and customers are. And it's also going to be important for property investors to understand the needs of the different generations for whom they're going to be providing accommodation. So today we're going to start off by taking a deep dive into the generation that's arguably had the most profound impact on modern Australia, the baby boomers. Whether you're a baby boomer yourself, part of a younger generation looking to understand your predecessors, or just interested in the forces shaping our country, I hope this episode is going to provide you with valuable insights and thoughtful discussions. In fact, I'm sure it is, because Simon's always got great ideas. So let's move on, Simon. This is going to be a great show.
It's going to be good fun. One of the big topics that is always being discussed in the generational narrative are the baby boomers, because they are so gigantic. They will always, forever onwards in history, stick out as the highest ever recorded birth rate in Australia.
Well, let's go through it then, Simon. Sorry to interrupt you. Give us an overview of the baby boomer generation. When were they born, and how large a cohort are they in Australia?
Well, so the baby boomers were first born at the end of the Second World War. So once the Second World War was finished, birth rates shot upwards, which is why we start counting them as the baby boomer cohort, and they were just that, a boom of babies. Birth rates shoot upwards. And in order to understand why we had this sudden surge of births, this was a sense of optimism. Decades before the end of the Second World War, Australia had it really, really tough. There was the First World War in the late teens of the previous century. Then there was the Great Depression in the 20s. Then you had the Second World War in the 30s and 40s. That is intense. An intense time to go through as a country. And finally, when these things are behind us, there is a sense of optimism. We can move forward. And that's the secret weapon to increase birth rates is no policy that you can do. It's just having a population that is outrageously optimistic about the future. And we had that mix.
Well, nowadays they're still in the workforce, but I'm a baby boomer, are slowly moving out of the workforce. What percentage of the workforce is still made up by baby boomers?
Exactly. By now, the boomers make up around 11% of the workforce, and in a decade that'll only be 2%. That's because right now the oldest baby boomer is 79, the youngest one is 63, or something like this. So we have most of this cohort already of retirement age.
Now, we've already had a chat about the baby boomers in a previous episode. So if this is of interest to you, on whatever podcast app you're listening to this, on your phone, or if you're watching the YouTube video, we spoke about the silver tsunami and the aging baby boomers. We're going to discuss different matters today. And we also talked about the great wealth transfer. So baby boomers are still making their mark, aren't they?
Exactly. Not necessarily in the world of work anymore, because they're leaving that behind. And so they'll step back from most of the corporate jobs. Bit by bit, they're leaving government behind. Eventually, they'll even vacate the boards of this country. But they're still a big voter cohort. They make up 70% of the population. They're voters because they're all citizens, not all, but a big share of them are citizens, so that they vote heavily, and they own a lot of money. So they are the richest generation in Australia. That means their capital decisions, they still very much shape the country in the coming decade, but not so much organizational culture and not so much the politics, so to speak. So that influence will step back year after year. So that means that the last generation that cares about hierarchies is gone. So there is a more looser, flatter organizational political structure that is now bit by bit establishing itself as younger generations take over. And all the younger generations are essentially allergic to hierarchies, whereas boomers still value those hierarchies.
Well, boomers think differently, as we discussed in last week's show. Each generation thinks differently. So if you asked a boomer, they'd probably call themselves dependable. They'd probably call themselves independent and resilient, and other generations flaky, Simon.
Exactly. And again, this is the result of how you were raised. When we want to understand baby boomers, we need to understand who raised them. Their parents lived through the First World War, Second World War, Great Depression. So if this is your upbringing as a parent, what values do you push on your kids? You tell your kids that just materialistic success is absolutely crucial because times can get tough very easily. So you better store some wealth away. This is your safety ticket. And boomers took this message to heart. They worked very hard. They worked over many, many decades. And we always say they were happy to forego family time in order to increase family income. And they always did this with the clear understanding that you work hard during your career to then really enjoy your golden years. And by now, the vast majority of boomers are already of retirement age. In a decade, they'll all be retired. And so that means they finally reached that stage of the life cycle that they have always been working towards. And they are determined as consumers to make the most of it. So there is, and probably will never ever be, such a wonderful consumer cohort as the baby boomers in this decade. Because, well, they benefited economically through rising house prices, economic tailwinds. They're rich. They own their own homes. Those homes go up in value. That leads to the wealth effect, meaning they feel richer. Then when you feel richer, you are more likely to spend money. And in the coming decade, boomers are still healthy and active. Yes, the joints hurt and so forth, but overall, they are a generation that has money, that has time, that has the health and energy to travel, to consume. And because of the pandemic, where they feel very much cheated out of 2 golden years of their retirement, they even have this urgency to part with their money. This is, if you were to create the dream consumer in a lab, you couldn't come up with a better person than the baby boomer.
Well, as we said, this series of generational podcasts is to help business people understand what generation they should be aiming at, or at least what in the mind of their consumers. So I think if you spoke to boomers, some of their top hopes would be to have financial independence and to pursue their interests and hobbies and to travel and to see the world. But also if you asked them about their fears, I think you'd find that some would still be concerned, I don't have enough money to live comfortably. Baby boomers didn't have the benefit of superannuation in the early days. So while many of them own their own homes and they have had some superannuation, when you see those results of how much they have, they're not certain it's going to see them through. And I think one of the other fears some have is suffering a long-term illness. That starts to come into your mind as you become a baby boomer, Simon.
Exactly. And that's a nice example of some of those fears that you talked about are simple results of the stage of the life cycle. To quote Bernard Salt, my business partner, he always says, the closer you get to God, the closer you get to God. So you then just become they're more quintessential, fundamental concerns that you have as you age, and that's a result of life. Of getting older. So these things don't change. But certain boomer mechanisms that you talked about is the idea of, well, are we running out of wealth? That's am I running out of money before I die? That's also to a degree a universal fear. So that's not going to change anytime soon. We could say these fears might soften because you'll have more and more people retire with significant superannuation savings that should carry them through. We'll have more and more people who have the right insurance products as well to make sure that they're safe from that perspective in retirement. So maybe those fears get lessened over time if all the people that go into retirement are just as rich as the boomers are. And we increasingly see trends where society is splitting into two, where the middle class gets weakened. You have more rich retirees, more poor retirees. So we then see that this narrative of boomers are rich, they all retire with wealth is not true. Overall, most boomers retire with significant or enough wealth. Not all. But again, we're talking about millions of people.
Well, I think the other fact is that some don't retire straight away. They do it gently because many boomers aren't working physically with their body, so they still can provide good information in the workplace. They still can do their office jobs. So that's a bit different from the old days where you got that golden watch after working for a company for 30 years and suddenly stopped working.
Exactly. And that's one nice example where we see that the boomers so far changed every stage of the life cycle that they ever lived through. And now they're doing the same with retirement. They will do the same with old age. They will even do the same thing with the process of dying. And right now in retirement, this is the first cohort that got significant free university education, easy access to education, highly educated or much more educated than previous generations, much more knowledge workers, people that can work into their late 60s, early 70s easily. So why would they step back? We know from plenty of sociological research that their mental health will be much better if they continue working. As long as they work out of choice, not out of sheer necessity, meaning they have absolutely no retirement savings. That is the working and aging poor that the US, for example, has an absolute bucket load of. And that should be the explicit goal of a country to avoid having these kind of cohorts in the system. So that's boomers shifting retirement forever.
I remember when I first went to America many years ago seeing elderly people, well, they were elderly to me. I guess I'm that age now. People in their 70s serving at restaurants, pouring coffees. You see that in the movies still today. You don't see that in Australia, do you? The baby boomers don't take on those sort of jobs in general.
Exactly. And that's a good sign. That's a sign of a successful society, is that you ensure that after decades of working hard, you can actually retire in dignity, in wealth, in comfort, whatever it is. At least significant amounts of people. Getting this right as a society is incredibly hard, but it must always be an explicit goal of society to get this right.
Yes, I like that idea. So some people listening to this, watching us on YouTube, are going to have baby boomers as their employers, as their bosses, as their team leaders. How do baby boomers prefer to communicate in the workplace? And then in return, what are some effective ways to engage with them, Simon?
Yeah, so well, when you want to engage with them, you get away with quite a bit of moralistic and value-driven narratives. The same, by the way, with millennials. We'll talk about this in 2 weeks' time. But this is a generation that thinks highly of themselves, that thinks of themselves as an independent-minded and almost a bit self-righteous generation. So the value-driven language works, adhering to the good in mankind, to the inner core of your humanity. That stuff works really well. When marketing to them, when selling them the idea of maybe working on after retirement age or something like this, moralistic, value-driven narratives do work with baby boomers. That's definitely true. The other part of the question was,
how do we engage better with baby boomers was part of it. And one was also, how do your bosses, what do they expect from you if they are a baby boomer?
Yeah, I think one of the nice elements here is the idea of technology. So baby boomers are much more tech savvy than previous generation of aging people were. That's because boomers as a cohort worked on for so long, and so their workforce essentially forced new technology, computer, laptops, iPads, iPhones on them. And that kept them up to date. And so they retire with an absolute strong tech-savvy type background. And now they're, and just as they retire, they become grandparents. So then their kids will keep them up to date with, video chat technology, these kind of things. And that's pretty good. So we can deal with boomers in retirement as a much more connected cohort, that if we use this right, we make sure that loneliness and old age can be minimized, at least theoretically, if we utilize it for the absolute best. These technologies, who knows if we will, but there are opportunities there. And of course, boomers as bosses, they very much want hardworking people who essentially emulate their own early career days. And that, of course, we mentioned it before, is a bit rare, because the young people nowadays, they don't need to work that hard, because, well, there's not that many to go around, not that many staff. They can put more demands on the wages early on in their career. So there's a reason why boomers complain, it's so hard to find decent staff these days. There's, of course, the general idea that we mentioned in the past as well of the general skills shortage, just meaning that we don't have nearly as many young people these days than we had in the past. And therefore, these young people don't need to be as driven and pushy and really keen for the next promotion, because more and more things in the world of work will just fall in place for them.
Now, we've spoken a bit about wealth and housing and the wealth transfer for baby boomers in previous shows. So let's do a short version of it today for those who haven't listened to previous podcasts. But if you're listening to us for the first time, just follow this podcast on whichever podcast app you're listening to or on YouTube, and go back and play some of the old shows, because Simon has shared some great words of wisdom. And one of them was the fact that baby boomers in general own their homes, have paid them off because they bought them 30, 40 years ago. The total housing market in Australia is worth in the order of $11 trillion. And more than half of that is currently owned by baby boomers who paid off their homes only because they've been in there for such a long time. But as they eventually die off, Simon, we know there's going to be a significant wealth transfer to future generations. There's been various estimates of how much it could be, somewhere between $4.5 and even $6 trillion over a period of time in the 2030s, over the next decade. But a lot of baby boomers are already giving it away to their children and grandchildren today, aren't they?
Exactly, and that's the smartest thing they can do for the family unit. So if you are rich enough to be almost certain that you're not going to run out of money, you should hand down as much wealth as you can to your kids right now.
I hope my kids aren't listening.
Exactly. Don't show them. But so the idea there is particularly the power of mortgage. Mortgage, of course, is leveraged wealth to begin with. And I always joke that a mortgage is nothing but a poverty penalty. You get punished by the bank because you're not rich enough to pay cash. And so at the moment, it would be somewhat realistic to be in that interest rate of around 5.3% over a 30-year runway. That's roughly realistic at the moment. And that just happens to be the exact time, 5.3% for 30 years, when you pay twice the amount of money to the bank. So if you have a $500,000 mortgage, you pay $1 million to the bank. That's the logic there. And then you realize, as a family unit, if your baby boomer parents are rich enough to hand down $100,000 to their kids right now, they actually don't give them $100,000. They give them $200,000 because they need to pay back so much less money. That's, of course, a big sales pitch for the bank of mom and dad. Most lucrative financial tool you can utilize, but it points to certain kind of structural injustices, if you will, because if you have a family, a young family that is just as capable as the next family with the same educational markers, the same employment, but one family has the bank of mom and dad to draw from, the other one doesn't, one family will be able to accrue much, much more wealth over the next 30, 40 years because they got this initial leg up. And those $100,000 turning into $200,000, turning into higher saving potential in the future makes an absolute massive difference. And so we go, well, how are we going to level this playing field? And that's when society needs to come up with discussions, needs to decide what to do. You could tax wealth. You could tax wealth transfers. You could tax, wealth transfer in a different way. Politically somewhat difficult to push through. But you go, what do we want as a society? And at the moment, we're actually ducking away from even having those discussions Of course, nobody's touching anything like this at the moment, but we're not even having open, honest discussions as a group of people.
Well, we've gone into that in a lot of detail in previous shows, so we'll allow people to go back and listen to those. But over the decades, baby boomers have also influenced our housing market significantly. They were able to start moving out to the suburbs, partly because cars became cheaper, transport became cheaper, so they caused the building of all these outer suburbs, which today in our cities have become middle ring suburbs. They bought their homes, but now many of them have, I guess, outlived the use of these big, large homes. Many are right-sizing. They're finding it difficulty, though, finding the right sort of accommodation where they want to live, where they want to retire, Simon.
Yeah, so structurally speaking, now would be the time when a generation like the baby boomers downsize and they go into the next stage of the life cycle where they load off the hard work that is associated with a big house, but they're not incentivized to do it. Everything works against downsizing at the moment. First and foremost, there is not the same type of the attractive downsizer dwelling stock available in the same neighborhood. If you want to downsize from a 4 and 5 bedroom to a 2 bedroom, that's not available in the same neighborhood. So that's...
Sorry to interrupt you, Simon, but I think that's a really important point. They want to stay in the same neighborhood. They don't look for tree change and sea change in general. Many of them want to go to the same hairdresser, the same dentist, be around their community, and in particular be close to family.
Exactly. And so the family aspect, God knows, that might be outside. So there is the concept of the tag-along grandparent. These are the people who then downsize near the home of the grandkids, so to speak. So that exists as well, but not at a phenomenon at scale. So overwhelmingly, to speak in those big generational cliches, boomers if they want to downsize, they want to downsize locally, make best use of the network that they have. They get used to a certain kind of lifestyle. They know the area. They appreciate the area. So that's tough. And of course, then if you really make the decision to downsize, then stamp duty, for example, all of a sudden becomes a hindrance because that makes it less attractive to right size your property. Things like, oh, that's too much work. Let's just stay in there. Plus, you know that your property continued to accrue wealth and create wealth for you over the last decades. In many cases, your property made you more wealth by just sitting there than you going to work. And you go, well, why would I sell this thing now? That'd be silly. So you time it. You don't sell as long as the stock goes up, if you will. So that's an issue for the boomers right there. So yeah, they're not really incentivized to downsize at scale. So when we want to know when baby boomer stock becomes available, we don't need to think about the intentions to downsize. We just need to count the demographic data to see when they will die out of their properties.
Oh, that's an interesting thought. But between then and where they are now, some baby boomers are going to have to go into aged care. How are their aged care and the healthcare needs going to impact things moving forward?
Yeah, and so that's where we reach yet another stage of the life cycle that boomers will completely transform, and they're going to be the victims of their own size there, because they are now moving into retirement villages, then they'll be moving into aged care homes, at least from the stage of the life cycle narrative. And in the next 14 years, we're doubling the 85 plus cohort. 85 is the aged care population. And at 85, the people that are alive, 85 and older, half of them need care on a daily basis. And if we roughly double the demand for aged care workers in the next 14 years, we know that it can't be done. Even under high migration scenario, we will get nowhere near the aged care workforce that we need. So that guarantees to me that boomers will completely transform the way we retire. Aged care providers will adjust to a certain degree. They will find ways to be more efficient, to utilize technology and utilize the built environment in a way to need slightly fewer aged care workers. But boomers will just adjust to this by trying everything they can to be healthier or to live independently, with a bit more sense of security. So like a wearable device around your wrist, an Apple Watch, that could detect a fall. So then you're confident to live independently for longer. That stuff makes the world of a difference. Doesn't sound like much, but if you know that we're doubling the 85 plus cohort from just under 600,000 people to 1.2 million people in 14 years, this helps us to minimize the aged care needs. So boomers, of course, particularly, let's call it the bottom third of the wealth spectrum of the baby boomers. I'm not that optimistic about their retirement, because how are they going to receive the care that they need and deserve? That's going to be a massive challenge, and we'll see how we react to this as a society.
Well, it's also going to be a challenge to the Australian economy, because more of them are going to need healthcare that the government is providing. More of them are going to be on the pension because, as we said, some have got money, but others didn't have the benefit of a whole work life of pension, of superannuation. So that's putting a strain on the government coffers, the budgets, which we know at the moment aren't being haven't got enough money in them anyway. So on that basis, I can't see any answer other than importing younger people who are going to keep paying tax. Otherwise, the current population is going to have to pay more tax to support the baby boomers. I don't think they want to do that, Simon.
No, I'm absolutely convinced that we are not going to massively decrease our population intake. I actually would say we'd rather upgrade it. Because it solves so many problems at the older end of the spectrum. It solves the skills shortage that we talked about in past podcasts. So I would just think that the whole anti-immigration or cutting immigration narrative will not play out. I think that it is mostly cheap politicking, and we've seen this. This might be timed poorly very soon, but at the moment it is being discussed to cut down international student numbers, and then of course. The unis and many economists point out all of those problems. It is a nice short cut to migration numbers that looks good on a bit of a populist type statement, but you create more problems than you solve. And so ultimately, if you cut it, you'll eventually put it back up again.
Well, it's not really the students that are creating the housing shortage, but we've got a housing problem, not an immigration problem. And as you've often said, the housing minister and the immigration minister should speak to each other. We need the students to help support the private universities and the public universities so that we can give us all the Australians good education, keep doing the research. And we also need them to keep the wheels of the economy going, because they do spend a lot, and it's one of our biggest exports. So that's really, I guess, some political rhetoric, isn't it? Now, Simon, baby boomers, in my mind anyway, I hope I'm right, will bring a wealth of experience, a wealth of knowledge. How can society better leverage that rather than just letting sit around because they're now going to retire?
Exactly. So the chance is, especially since we have this backdrop of a looming skills shortage or continued skills shortage, and you have this highly educated, highly influential bunch of boomers retiring. The question then raises itself for society. How do we utilize the knowledge and wisdom of baby boomers? It's not because they're baby boomers that we should do the same with older cohorts as well already. We shouldn't have them be presidents of the most powerful country of on the planet, but because there are certain kind of mental declines and just the physical attributes decline. That's true, but you need to tap into wisdom. I'm talking about council of elders, so to speak. I'm talking about us being switched on enough to really proactively ask the baby boomers that are in retirement, semi-retirement, to be part of a thing, whatever that thing is. Have them utilize their skills, their wisdom, their experience in a meaningful way. It's very, very important for boomers in old age, because we do know that once you retire, particularly if you're a man, your mental health declines. It's great, and then it declines, because if a lot of your personality was wound up in your work persona, you got a lot of your self-confidence out of being a successful person in your job, in your industry, and that falls away. You got nothing. And that's when divorces spike. That's when suicides spike. This can be a terrible time of the life cycle. And hopefully we can counter this. And volunteering ticks so many boxes. But what we know from volunteering research is that the best chance to make sure somebody becomes a volunteer is to ask them. It is just that simple. Few people proactively seek out a role in society, but when you're being asked, much more people than you might intuit are willing to step up and to that challenge.
Do you see any particular points of tension between baby boomers and younger generations, maybe the Gen Zs or the millennials?
Well, so all of the conflicts that baby boomers have with their millennial, co-workers and so forth, they're almost systemic issues in there because these are parents and kids type relationships. So these conflicts always feel very, very personal, even if the particular co-worker in question is not your daughter or your mother or whatever, but they have that. That rough dynamic in there. So that's certainly an element that is in there. I really find it comical to compare the youngest and the oldest generations because the gap of technology, the gap of the country that they grew up in, meaning the Australia of whether you grew up in Australia in the 2010s or you grew up in Australia in the 2060s and 70s, they're different places, completely different places. And we cannot assume that this is the same. And it's absolutely crucial that we remind ourselves that the world is not the same than it was 40 years ago, and pretending we want to retain this perfect status quo of today for the next 40 years, that's not it. We always want to manage change rather than have it blindly happen to us. But the idea that you can block and withstand change, I find ridiculous, because my job is to constantly look into the past as well and just analyze past change. We see that it is happening anyways. So, it's just pointless to fight this massive trend.
Now, I'm putting you in the shoes of a baby boomer, Simon, but what advice do you think baby boomers would have for younger generations when it comes to, I don't know, whether it's career, finance, or life choices?
Yeah, I think one of the big bits of advice would be work hard, it will ultimately pay off. This is a quote that actually did work hard. Yeah, it's easy to make jokes about boomers and say they had everything stacked in their favor. I was like, sure, yeah, it did help when house prices were cost 3 times your annual income rather than now 10 times. That's better. For that particular young person, but they did work hard. So that idea is actually legit true. And when you don't acknowledge that those things were both true at the same time, then you just have people barking at each other and nothing gets done, and you are not inching closer towards understanding the point of view of other generation.
So, Simon, thank you for teaching us about the baby boomers. Next week, we're going to talk about the next generation, the Generation X's. And again, I believe this series is valuable whether you are a baby boomer, Generation X, a millennial, whatever, because it's useful to understand how others in the world think. I guess one of the things I learned over time from people such as yourself is that we don't all think the same. And when you see other people, Simon, I think they're crazy. How could they think like that? They look back at us and think exactly the same. So it's going to be very useful to understand these. Now, if you found some benefit from the sort of information Simon gives and you think that would help benefit you in your business, in your organization, in your, or if you work for government, I'm going to leave a link in the show notes to the demographics group and have a chat with Fiona about getting Simon to present at your organisation, because that's what you do much of the day, isn't it, Simon?
That's all I do, essentially, is constantly trying to understand how the world works and then package this up in for presentations, for research pieces to the clients. And the fun stuff with demographic work, as much as generational work, is that you can absolutely cut it down to the exact industry, audience, geography in question. No presentation is ever the same. It's always new and fun material.
Well, I know that your research actually does that in great detail, and even you've been dealing with people in New Zealand. So it's not just based on Australia. Anyway, I'll leave a link in the show notes, and you can see the depth of information Simon can give and how it can change your business. Similarly, you can follow Simon on social media, and I'll leave a link for that in the show notes. And if you got some benefit from this and you now want to learn about the other generations and you don't currently subscribe or follow this podcast, whichever podcast app you're on, please just stop for a sec and subscribe so that once a week, every Wednesday, we can update you on what's ahead for your future. We unveil the trends shaping your future. Thanks again, and I look forward to catching up with you next week, Simon.
I'll catch you next week.
This Demographics Decoded podcast was brought to you by Metropole Property Strategists. We provide a complete range of services to help our clients safely create intergenerational wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you're looking to buy an investment property or your next home, why not have a discovery chat with one of our wealth strategists? Go to metropole.com.au and explore your options. You'll find we're much more than just another buyer's agent. We provide a complete range of services, including property and wealth advisory, home buying, buyer's agency, property management, renovations, and development management services. The team will help you with frameworks that I've fine-tuned over 5 decades, and we've been helping clients with for over 25 years. We're big enough to tip the scales in your favour, but still small enough to care. You can follow me on social media, but I suggest you also follow Simon Kuestenmacher. You'll find him regularly posting on all the social media platforms. I'll include links in the show notes. And thanks for spending the last little while with Simon and me. I hope you got some benefit from the show. And if you did, and you know somebody else who'd also benefit, please tell them about the Demographics Decoded podcast. There's a share button on every podcast app. You'll be doing them a favour. I hope you will anyway, and you're definitely going to be doing us a favour, helping us in our quest to make as many people as possible aware of the demographic changes that are going to shape their future. And of course, any of the discussion we had today was not personal advice about your future, but just general information to help inform